Today, on the heels of the historic United Nations vote concerning the reclassification of cannabis under the 1961 UN Convention on Narcotic Drugs, the United States House of Representatives passed the MORE Act. And the MORE Act is the Marijuana Opportunity, Reinvestment and Expungement Act. And the name says a lot, but we are here in 2020 in a year that has been marred by social injustice across the United States and around the world, and marred with a global pandemic and corresponding economic downturn. 2020 has turned out to be an enormous year for the cannabis plant and the cannabis industry. And finally, Congress has done its job, at least in part, considering the vote passing the MORE Act out of the House of Representatives was largely in line with partisan politics, with a handful of Republicans voting in favor of the measure and less than a handful of Democrats voting against it. What I mean, though, is Congress has finally done its job on the heels of multiple election day victories for the cannabis industry, where it has put into place state-based cannabis reform, regulations, commercial industries, and patient rights, not to mention criminal justice reform across the United States of America. There's been numerous proposals over the years. Some of them have even been fairly bipartisan when you look at something like the STATES Act or the Safe Banking Act. But this was one that would actually take steps to address the racial disparity and social injustice across America and the lengthy, prejudicial, race-based history of the Controlled Substances Act, and prior to that with the Marijuana Tax Act in the 1930s. The states have already spoken. Even this election day, we had a green wave that has led to the enactment of cannabis commercial programs across many states, including adult use or recreational use programs. Now, what does the MORE Act do? It removes marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act. In 1937, you had the Marijuana Tax Act, which clearly combined the industrial hemp uses and the so-called intoxicating or marijuana-based uses from THC, even though they didn't necessarily understand what THC was at the time, and combined that into a law that prohibited the cultivation of that plant and or the possession in America without a tax stamp, which effectively created a self-incrimination scenario. Then, of course, in the 1970s, you had the U.S. implementation of its obligations under the 1961 UN Convention, which therefore created the Controlled Substances Act. And marijuana has been defined as such and treated as a dangerous narcotic since those days, spanning nearly 100 years, if not more, in the United States in terms of its policies. So as we look forward to this event today, it did succeed in the House of Representatives. And as mentioned, some voted for it, but of course it has to go to the U.S. Senate. And to go to the U.S. Senate, you're looking at a Republican-controlled body. Now, presently, in the absence of the final voting for the 2 Senate seats out of the state of Georgia, there is a balance in the Senate that would continue and maintain Republican control. However, what does hang in the balance is the Senate votes from the state of Georgia. Could the state of Georgia ultimately determine the outcome of federal cannabis legalization in the United States of America? Was this historic vote from Congress, from the House of Representatives, akin to a carrot, if you will, for those voters who may not otherwise be interested in participating in the vote come January for the state of Georgia, whereby that state could elect 1, if not 2, Democrat senators and shift the balance of the Senate, therefore effectuating marijuana legalization and descheduling at the federal level? It's an interesting perspective and definitely strange times that we live in. Now, when you think about the fact that this was based on personal choice and public health components, and that there is a taxation component to this, this is a bill that ultimately, if enacted into law, would create the foundation for a taxing system and a lawful cannabis industry in the United States. It has a significant social equity ownership component where it seeks to create a loan program for populations that were disproportionately affected by the criminalization of cannabis. How all of this will work in practice remains to be seen. After all, legislation is merely the broad strokes of what later gets delegated down to agencies for implementation at the regulatory level, as we've seen across the country and across the world in so many countries that have legalized this plan. So stay tuned, as only time will tell how this historic vote impacts U.S. cannabis policy going forward, even though it's unlikely in its present iteration to get passed out of the Senate. It does provide an interesting item to consider for those Georgia voters on Election Day in January of 2021 for those 2 Senate seats, and it presents a very promising foundation for a commercial cannabis industry in the United States of America.